Imagine yourself waking up in a drafty stone hall somewhere in northern Europe in the 13th century. The fire in the hearth has long gone out, and the dampness of the night has crept into every stone, every beam, every bed. Your clothes are scratchy wool, but the first thing you notice isn't the chill on your skin. It's the cold, heavy weight of the thing that has defined your class, your status, and your daily dread, your armor. For the medieval knight, armor was life. It was protection, status, and often the single most expensive thing he owned. But behind the polished sheen of chainmail or plate, behind the image of the knight as an unstoppable warrior, lurked an enemy far more insidious than the edge of any sword: rust. Rust was not simply a nuisance. It was a constant, gnawing terror. A knight's armor could take years of wages to afford, and once crafted, it had to be maintained daily. You, the knight, couldn't simply hang it up and expect it to gleam the next morning. The damp European climate, with its endless rain, fog, and cold, made iron's natural enemy, oxidation, an unavoidable companion. And unlike a battle scar, which added honor to your armor, rust was a mark of neglect, weakness, and impending uselessness. Think of it. A sword strike might damage a single plate or pierce a ring in your chainmail, but rust could spread silently, eating away at every link, every joint, every hinge. Where the sword announced itself with clang and pain, rust whispered, slowly weakening, until one day your armor failed just when you needed it most. But it wasn't just the fear of vulnerability in combat that haunted knights. Armor represented wealth. Owning a good suit of chainmail or plate was like owning a mansion today. Letting it decay meant losing not just protection, but also prestige. A knight with rusty armor was not only less safe on the battlefield, he was shamed, diminished, his very honor in question. The daily rituals of knights often revolve around this invisible battle. Servants, squires, and sometimes the knights themselves would spend hours rubbing down armor with oil, polishing it with sand, and inspecting each crevice of the telltale reddish stain. Imagine sitting for hours by candlelight, running your fingers over iron, oil-soaked cloth in hand, because neglect meant not just discomfort but ruin. And here's the twist. The very conditions of medieval warfare made rust nearly unavoidable. Campaigns often stretched for months in the mud, rain, and blood-soaked fields. Soldiers might march for weeks without shelter, their armor exposed to the elements. Imagine the dread of returning from a skirmish, soaked through, too exhausted to eat, yet knowing you had to strip down your armor and dry every piece, lest the silent killer claim it by morning. Rust, in this sense, was not just chemical. It was psychological. It gnawed at a knight's peace of mind. It demanded vigilance equal to that required on the battlefield. Many knights may have fallen to fatigue, not from swords, but from the endless, grinding war against elements. And yet, as much as knights feared rust, they had little choice but to live with it. Innovations came slowly. Oils and greases helped, but they were messy, expensive, and temporary. No knight ever felt secure that his armor was truly safe. It was always a ticking clock, always a reminder that glory could corrode into ruin if neglected for even a few days. Now imagine this. On the eve of battle, standing in formation, sword in hand. You glance to the knight beside you. His armor gleams in a rising sun, a mirror of discipline and wealth. But you know what he knows. The sheen is temporary, fragile. Tomorrow, after rain, mud, and blood, you both will kneel again by the fire, cloth in hand, fighting not enemies of flesh, but of air and time itself. Knights were trained to fear many things: ambushes, cavalry charges, sieges. But in the quiet of their chambers, when the battlefield was far away, it was the creeping stain of rust that haunted them most of all. And here lies the question. Was the knight's greatest enemy truly the enemy before him, or the unseen decay working silently within his own armor? If a knight's battlefield was a field of combat, then his second battlefield was the courtyard, the workshop, or even the quiet glow of the firelight in his hall. The war against rust was fought not only with swords and spears, but with oil, cloth, and sand. And unlike the blood and clash of combat, this war never ended. Every suit of armor was a system of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of parts. A chainmail shirt, for example, might contain as many as 40,000 interlinked rings of iron. Imagine holding such a shirt in your hands. Heavy, flexible, impressive. But then imagine the burden of maintenance. Each one of those tiny rings could become a starting point for rust. If even a few rings corroded, the strength of the entire shirt was compromised. Knights knew this. Squires knew it better, for it was a squire who bore much of this endless duty. Every evening after a long day of training or riding, the knight could toss his armor down, exhausted, while the squire began the tedious ritual of care. Oil was rubbed into the iron. Sand or ash was used to scour off the beginnings of red stains. Water had to be wiped away carefully. Yet even wiping was dangerous, for rough handling could scratch the metal and make it more vulnerable to oxidation later. Picture a squire hunched over, candlelight flickering across his face, running his hand along the cold plates of a breastplate. He is not looking for dents or cracks. He is hunting for something far smaller, far more dangerous. A faint orange tint, a shadow of decay. His eyes must be sharp, because if he missed it, tomorrow that speck could spread, and the knight's armor would be weaker, uglier, and worth less. And the work was never-ending. Even when the armor wasn't in use, the battle continued. Stored armor was just as vulnerable to the damp air of castles and manors. The walls of those stone halls we often imagine as noble and strong. They dripped with condensation in winter, wept with rain in summer, and provided the perfect environment for rust to breed. Armor could not be left alone. To do so was to invite ruin. But this was not merely a technical inconvenience. It was an economic burden. A full suit of plate armor in the late Middle Ages could cost as much as a small farm. Chain mail was cheaper, but still enormously expensive. These were not disposable tools. They were generational investments, sometimes passed down from father to son. Protecting armor was protecting wealth. A rusty suit of armor might not only endanger the knight's life, it could also bankrupt his household. The expenses did not end at purchase. Maintaining armor required resources. Oils had to be imported or produced. Cleaning materials had to be acquired. The time of squires and servants had to be paid for. And still, despite all this, rust was never fully banished. It always lurked at the edges, reminding everyone that even the most glorious knight was a servant to nature's chemistry. It is no wonder, then, that the knightly ideal of shining armor became as much a symbol of wealth and discipline as it was a martial power. A knight with gleaming armor was not only ready for war, he was demonstrating that his household was strong enough to fight the invisible war of upkeep. His armor reflected not just his courage, but the unseen labor of squires, servants, wives, and children who ensured that the silent killer had been held back another day. And so, behind every knight in shining armor was a small army of cleaners, polishers, and caretakers, none of whom were celebrated in song or story. The knight might win fame on the battlefield, but his armor survival was a result of endless, unseen toil in the shadows of his own hall. Yet, the irony of the struggle is clear. The knight who devoted his life to war was often chained just as tightly to peace. He could not ignore his armor for even a week without paying the price. In that sense, rust was a great equalizer. It reminded lords and warriors alike that no matter how high their status, no matter how many enemies they felled, they were never free from the quiet tyranny of decay. But here lies a lingering question. When the knight rode into battle, did he fear the clash of blades, or did he secretly wonder whether the true failure would come from within in the silent betrayal of his own corroding armor? By the time you reached the late Middle Ages, knights had fought rust for centuries and lost over and over again. No amount of polishing, no stockpile of oils, no small army of squires could truly conquer it. Rust was not a problem to be solved. It was a condition of existence. And in this way, it quietly shaped the course of military history. Consider first the very design of armor. Early chain mail, though flexible and protective, was the most vulnerable to rust. Each interlocking ring was a trap for moisture. Sweat, rain, and mud seeped into the links, and even the best cleaning could not guarantee complete protection. Knights could wear padded garments beneath their mail to absorb some dampness, but those garments themselves became heavy, moldy, and suffocating. As armorers experimented with plate armor, the goal was not just greater defense against weapons, but also a more manageable fight against rust. A solid plate was easier to clean and oil than tens of thousands of tiny rings. Yet even plates had crevices, hinges, and joints that could trap water. The battle never truly ended, but plate at least gave the knight a chance to keep the corrosion at bay with fewer man-hours of labor. Rust also dictated how armor was used in warfare. Knights who wore armor in wet weather knew that the next day would mean a double burden of cleaning. Campaign journals from 100 Years' War mentioned soldiers stripping down in muddy fields, trying desperately to dry pieces of armor with whatever rags or cloaks they could find. Exhaustion killed many campaigns as surely as the sword. The endless need to maintain armor drained energy and slowed armies. In some cases, commanders deliberately limited the amount of armor soldiers wore in order to keep the fight against rust and fatigue within reason. The economy of warfare was shaped by rust as well. Households poured money into the preservation of armor. Armories within castles were not just storage rooms but workshops, with constant activity, oiling, repairing, polishing. And still, rust meant armor had a limited lifespan. Even the finest Milanese plate would, in time, succumb to the creeping red stain. This made armor both precious and perishable, an uncomfortable combination for knights who wanted their children to inherit their martial glory. Over time, this constant frustration nudged Europe toward change. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the heavy knight in full armor began to fade. Gunpowder accelerated the decline, of course, but rust played its part. The sheer labor of keeping an army of knights battle-ready was immense. Armies began to favor lighter infantry mercenaries, and eventually professional soldiers with simpler equipment. A musket and powder could rust as well, but its upkeep was nothing compared to that of a full suit of plate. The image of the knight in gleaming armor lives on in art and legend, but the reality was more sobering. That sheen was temporary, an illusion crafted by endless toil. The knight's great strength, his iron shell, was also his greatest weakness. Rust reminded him that time was always against him. Even in peace, he was at war. And so the legacy of rust is not just chemical, but cultural. It influenced how armor was made, how wars were fought, and even how knights were remembered. We imagine them as unstoppable warriors, shining in the sun. But in truth, their lives were bound by quiet drudgery, by squires bent over oil-soaked rags, by nights spent listening to rain on a roof and wondering how much of their fortune would corrode before morning. The sword may have threatened the body, but rust threatened the very identity of knighthood. And in the end, it was rust, alongside powder and progress, that consigned the knight to history. But ask yourself this. If the knight's greatest fear was not the clash of armies, but the slow betrayal of his own armor, then what does that say about the battles we fight today? The unseen, quiet wars that shape our lives as surely as any battlefield? Close your eyes and step into a medieval street at dawn. The air is damp, carrying the heavy smell of wood smoke, livestock, and unwashed bodies. But woven into this rough tapestry of scents is something warmer, sweeter, almost sacred. The smell of baking bread. For the people of medieval Europe, bread was not food. It was life itself. In some regions, up to 70 to 80% of daily calories came from bread. Grain was the heart of survival, and the loaf was its most visible form. To have bread was to live. To lose bread was to starve. And that made it both sustenance and weapon, both comfort and curse. The simplicity of bread concealed the complexity of its power. At first glance, it was nothing more than flour, water, salt, and fire. But behind each loaf stood a chain of labor, politics, and struggle. Farmers tilled land under crushing obligations. Millers ground grain in wheels owned by lords or monasteries. Bakers bought the flour, baked the bread, and sold it to customers, while guilds, kings, and priests watched carefully, regulating every stage. The bread economy was brutally strict. A baker who short of weight could be fined, shamed, or even beaten. In England, bakers were bound by the assize of bread, a law first written in 1266 and enforced for centuries, which dictated the exact weight of loaves for a given price. If grain was cheap, loaves were larger. If grain was expensive, loaves shrank. But never could the baker cheat the customer outright, or so the law tried to promise. Punishments were severe. Bakers who cheated too often might be dragged through the streets with their underweight loaves hung around their necks. Bread, in this way, was as much about justice as about food. People measured fairness not in gold, but in loaves. A kingdom that could feed its people with consistent bread was seen as righteous. A king who failed to keep bread affordable was seen as weak, or worse, tyrannical. More than once, riots began not with cries against armies or taxes, but against bakers. But behind the bakery counter lay deeper struggles. The type of bread you ate revealed your place in the social order. The poor ate coarse, dark bread made of rye, barley, or even mixtures with beans and acorns when times were hard. The wealthy ate white bread, sifted and fine, soft enough to melt on the tongue. To eat white bread was to declare status. To eat black bread was to declare survival, and survival was never guaranteed. A bad harvest, a ruined mill, or a disrupted trade route could send entire towns into famine. Bread prices could double or triple in a season. The people watched those prices more closely than they watched their kings. A loaf of bread, shrinking on the table, was a clearer sign of crisis than any royal decree. It was not just economics, but psychology. Bread was memory. Families remembered famines not in years, but in empty ovens, in crusts too thin to divide among children. Bread shaped songs, superstitions, prayers. "Give us this day our daily bread" was not poetic but literal, a cry of dependence. Every loaf baked was a small victory against hunger, a fragile shield against chaos. And so bread became a quiet battlefield, a constant negotiation between survival and power. Lords demanded grain as rent, leaving peasants little for themselves. Kings taxed grain shipments, swelling their treasuries while stomachs shrank. Millers, always accused of dishonesty, were suspected of stealing a portion from every sack of grain. Every hand along the chain took its share, and the loaf that finally reached the table was smaller, harder, dearer than it should have been. Yet for all this, bread endured. Every day, ovens burned. Every day, flour turned to dough to crust. Every day, the people lined up to buy what they could afford. And every day, the fear lingered. What if tomorrow there is no bread? But here lies a question that haunted medieval life. If bread was both the symbol of survival and the spark of unrest, how long could kingdoms balance the loaf before it tipped into riot? If bread was the heartbeat of daily life, then the silence of empty ovens was the drumbeat of rebellion. History remembers great battles, sieges, and coronations, but many kingdoms shook not at the clash of swords, but at the shortage of loaves. Bread riots were not a rarity. They were an inevitability. Wherever grain failed or rulers mismanaged supplies, people poured into the streets with anger sharp as hunger. In France, in England, in the German states, the story repeated. When bread disappeared, so did patience. The psychology of bread riots was unique. Unlike uprisings over taxes or feuds between nobles, riots over bread were visceral. They were not about abstract justice, but about survival. A loaf of bread was not a symbol. It was dinner for a child. To raise its price beyond reach was to place a dagger at the throat of every family. And so people struck back not with reasoned petitions, but with fists, stones, and fire. Bakers stood at the front line of this conflict. Though often themselves victims of rising grain costs, bakers were the visible face of the problem. The people did not see the Lord's tax collector or the merchant hoarding grain in distant warehouses. They saw the man behind the counter, weighing flour, setting prices, shrinking loaves. And when tempers rose, it was his shop that burned. In medieval London, bakers accused of selling underweight loaves could be dragged through the streets, their bread tied around their necks in humiliation. In parts of France, townspeople stormed bakeries and seized bread, declaring their theft justified by hunger. Sometimes rulers turned a blind eye, fearing the cost of punishing the starving. Other times, troops were called in, and blood was spilled over crusts and crumbs. But the riot was only the surface of a deeper struggle. Behind it lay the politics of famine. A poor harvest could devastate a region, but how rulers responded determined whether discontent turned to revolt. Wise kings and lords opened granaries, sold grain at reduced prices, or distributed bread directly to the hungry. Others hoarded supplies, raised prices, or prioritized feeding their armies over their peasants. The results were predictable. A loaf given could buy loyalty. A loaf denied could topple a throne. In this sense, bread was as sharp as any sword, a tool of power, control, and survival. Monarchs who ignored this fact often paid with rebellion. The ripple effect spread wide. Entire economies bent around bread. Farmers prayed for good harvests, knowing one bad year could ruin them. Merchants guarded grain routes as if they were treasure caravans. Armies marching through enemy territory often seized mills first, understanding that controlling bread was controlling the stomachs of both soldiers and citizens. And then there was the fear of famine, always lurking. Even in good years, memories of scarcity haunted villages. Elders recalled winters when bread was stretched with sawdust, ground beans, or weeds. These memories were passed down, seared into culture as stories, superstitions, and warnings. Children grew up hearing not just tales of dragons and saints, but of years when bread vanished and death stalked the land. Bread was thus more than food. It was a measure of trust between ruler and people. If rulers ensured bread, people tolerated taxes, wars, and hardship. If rulers failed, the people rose. Kings who commanded armies might believe they ruled by sword, but in truth, many ruled by loaf. And so the silent war of medieval bread was not just fought in ovens and markets. It was fought in hearts, in stomachs, in whispered curses against bakers and kings alike. For every crust denied was a reminder that survival itself was fragile and that hunger was never far away. But ask yourself this: if a loaf of bread could decide the loyalty of a people, then was the true strength of a kingdom measured in its armies or in its ovens? By the late Middle Ages and into the dawn of the early modern world, the war over bread grew louder. It was no longer just a question of hungry villagers storming a bakery. The stakes had risen. Bread was now at the heart of national survival, and entire revolutions began with the cry of an empty stomach. Consider France, centuries after medieval markets first codified the price of a loaf. By the 18th century, bread still dominated the French diet, and when harvest failed in the 1780s, prices soared beyond reach. The people of Paris and the countryside alike looked to the king for relief, but none came. In 1789, riots over bread were not isolated disturbances. They became sparks that set the French Revolution aflame. Historians often recount the storming of the Bastille, the drafting of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the guillotining of kings and queens. But underneath all the rhetoric of liberty and equality, there was always bread. The march of thousands of women to Versailles in October 1789, one of the defining moments of the Revolution, was not a march for philosophy. It was a march for bread. "Give us bread," they demanded. And in doing so, they dragged the king from his palace to Paris, never to return. This was not new. Bread had always been the quiet lever of power. The medieval rulers who learned to control grain, who ensured supplies and balanced prices, maintained peace. Those who failed were toppled, sometimes violently. The lesson, repeated across centuries, was simple: you cannot rule hungry people. But bread's legacy is not merely political. It shaped culture and class as well. In medieval Europe, the distinction between black bread and white bread mapped directly onto social order. Even as plate armor and castles disappeared, bread remained a marker of wealth. To eat soft, fine, white bread was to declare privilege. To chew coarse, dark rye was to declare necessity. Food was identity, and bread was its most visible form. This cultural divide carried forward into the modern era. In times of famine, the poor were mocked for their desperation, while elites dismissed their suffering. The infamous phrase attributed to Marie Antoinette, "Let them eat cake," whether true or apocryphal, reflects the chasm between those who worried about luxuries and those who begged for loaves. The silence between privilege and hunger was filled not with reason, but with rage. Looking back, bread seems deceptively simple. A crust, a crumb, a staple. But in reality, it was the axis on which kingdoms turned. It was a line between order and chaos, loyalty and rebellion, life and death. Knights may have fought for glory. Kings may have plotted for power. But for the vast majority of people, history was measured by the presence or absence of bread on the table. And in that sense, bread is not boring at all. It is a thread that ties together the quiet daily lives of millions across centuries. When you peel back the layers of wars and politics, what remains is this: a baker pulling loaf from the oven, a mother dividing a crust among her children, a crowd storming a market because there was nothing left to buy. So the silent war of medieval bread was never truly silent. It was a war that roared in the bellies of the people, a war that toppled kings, and a war that echoes even now. For even in the modern world, when prices rise and shelves empty, the unrest that follows is often the same story repeated in a different age. And so we are left to wonder, if the fate of nations could once be decided by the cost of a loaf, how different are we today? Or are we still ruled quietly by bread? Walk through the gates of any medieval city, and you will be struck first by the noise, the clang of smiths at their forges, the shouts of merchants at their stalls, the cries of children weaving through crowded alleys. The air smelled of smoke, dung, salted fish, and sweat. But somewhere beneath those layers of noise and odor was another presence, quieter, smaller, and far more influential than anyone cared to admit: the rat. Rats were not merely pests in the medieval city. They were its constant companions, shadowing every trade, every market, every home. Where people gathered, so too did rats, following the invisible trails of grain, waste, and scraps that humans left behind. They nested in thatched roofs, burrowed beneath wooden floors, and scuttled along gutters in the moonlight. If you lived in a city, you shared it with rats, whether you acknowledged it or not. The design of medieval cities made them the perfect rat kingdom. Walls that kept out invaders also kept in food and waste. Grain stores, cellars, and bakeries provided a steady diet. Rubbish heaps piled in courtyards, creating shelters. Water flowed in open ditches, offering both drinking sources and transport routes. To a rat, the medieval city was paradise. Endless resources, no predators strong enough to curb their numbers, and a constant stream of humans too preoccupied with survival to declare war on them. And yet, rats were more than background noise. They were, in a strange way, gatekeepers of the city's fate. Their presence decided whether food could be stored safely, whether armies on campaign would eat or starve, whether plagues would smolder or spread like wildfire. Kings and lords might have ruled on parchment and battlefield, but rats ruled in silence, in the cellars and granaries where real survival began. Consider the granary. It was the heart of any medieval settlement, the difference between famine and feast. Grain was not just food for the season, it was seed for the future. A single infestation of rats could reduce months of harvest to husks and droppings. And unlike humans, rats bred quickly, multiply in the shadows. A farmer might believe he had enough grain to last the winter, only to find his stores riddled with holes and hollow kernels when he needed them most. The cost was not only hunger, but instability. Grain shortages led to bread shortages, and bread shortages led to riots, as we saw in the last story. Thus, the humble rat, gnawing in silence, could trigger upheavals far larger than its size. Its teeth decided whether loaves would rise in the oven or whether markets would erupt in anger. Rats also played a darker role, one that etched itself into European memory forever. They became the carriers of plague. Whether directly through their fleas or indirectly by their presence in unsanitary streets, rats became synonymous with disease. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, killing perhaps a third of the population, it was rats that served as the silent couriers of catastrophe. Cities that had once bustled with life became ghostly, their gates guarded not by soldiers, but by an unseen army of rodents spreading death. Yet here lies the irony. People did not think of rats as rulers. They cursed them, feared them, and tried to kill them, but they never recognized their power fully. To admit that your fate rested on the habits of vermin was unthinkable. And so rats went unacknowledged, even as they determined the survival of families, armies, and nations. The rat, then, was the shadow gatekeeper, the creature no one honored yet everyone depended on. Its choices of nest and meal, its infestations and infestations avoided, shaped the rhythms of medieval life more surely than many laws or decrees. And so the question lingers, if the gates of cities were guarded by soldiers, but their survival was guarded by rats, who truly held the power. By the 13th century, Europe's cities were growing. Their walls expanded to hold markets, guilds, and the swelling tide of humanity. But every stone laid for defense, every granary built for storage, and every sewer dug for waste gave another foothold to the city's most persistent inhabitants, rats. Urban life in the Middle Ages was an exercise in constant negotiation with filth. Streets were narrow and rarely paved. Gutters doubled as sewers, and rubbish was often dumped outside the door. The same conditions that made cities dangerous for humans made them ideal for rats. A pile of straw left by a stable, a mound of discarded fish bones in the market, or a damp cellar beneath a bakery was all it took to sustain an entire colony. Authorities noticed, though often too late. In some cities, ordinances were written to control waste. Town councils ordered residents to clear rubbish from streets, fined butchers for dumping offal in open drains, and mandated the covering of grain stores. Yet these efforts were often sporadic, driven by immediate crisis rather than long-term vision. The truth was simple. Rats thrived because the very design of the medieval city invited them. Consider the granary again. Lords and city councils built large storehouses to secure food supplies, especially during siege. But unless carefully constructed, these buildings became rat fortresses. Wooden doors were gnawed through, grain sacks torn apart, beams hollowed by tiny teeth. Cats were brought in, dogs unleashed, traps laid, and yet the rats endured. Some estimates suggest that up to 10 to 15% of stored grain in medieval Europe was lost each year to vermin. That loss was not just numbers on a ledger. It was winter meals, seed for spring planting, the difference between stability and riot. As rat populations grew, so too did a growing awareness of public hygiene. The plague outbreaks of the 14th century forced cities to confront the invisible dangers of filth. It was not yet understood that fleas carried the Black Death, nor that rats were essential to its spread. But the connection between dirt, vermin, and disease became impossible to ignore. Some cities hired officials specifically tasked with monitoring street cleanliness. Others enforced rules on waste disposal more strictly, if only during epidemics. The link between rats and sickness etched itself into civic policy, however rudimentary. And then came the rise of rat catchers. These were men who made their living hunting vermin, often accompanied by dogs or ferrets. Some carried cages of captured rats to display their skill, parading them through marketplaces as proof of their usefulness. Others claimed mystical methods, selling powders, charms, or secret recipes to ward off infestations. They were both practical workers and figures of folklore, half tradesmen, half tricksters. Townsfolk relied on them, even as they doubted their promises. Rats, meanwhile, adapted. They were survivors, learning to avoid traps, to nest in places unreachable by cats or dogs, to scavenge at night when the streets were quiet. Their resilience meant that no matter how hard humans tried, they never truly won. At best, they managed a stalemate, an uneasy balance between extermination and infestation. This uneasy balance gave rats an invisible authority over city planning. Narrow alleys, poorly drained streets, and neglected cellars all became liabilities, not just for comfort, but for survival. Wealthier districts, with stone floors, tiled roofs, and servants to clean waste, fared better. Poorer quarters, with wooden shacks and refuse piled high, fared worse. Thus, rats became not only pests but markers of inequality. The poor lived closest to vermin, suffered most from their damage, and died in greatest numbers when plague returned. Behind every gate and wall of a medieval city, rats moved freely, indifferent to hierarchy. They did not respect kings or beggars, guild masters or apprentices. Yet in their indifference, they revealed the fragility of human power. A king might command knights and armies, but he could not command the rats gnawing at the grain meant to feed them. And so, silently, rats shaped medieval life. They determined whether food lasted the winter, whether disease erupted in summer, and whether a city thrived or crumbled under the weight of its own filth. But ask yourself this. If medieval rulers could build walls to hold back armies, but not rats, then who truly decided the fate of their cities? The men in the towers or the vermin in the cellars? By the late Middle Ages, rats were no longer just a nuisance scratching the walls of cities. They had become participants in history's grandest stage. Through ships, caravans, and armies, rats spread far beyond alleyways and cellars, hitching rides on the very networks that built kingdoms and empires. And everywhere they went, they reshaped human destiny. The most infamous example, of course, was the Black Death. In the mid-14th century, plague erupted in Central Asia, carried along trade routes like the Silk Road. When caravans of merchants and armies moved west, Rats move with them, concealed in sacks of grain beneath carts and in the shadows of cargo holds. By the time the plague reached Europe in 1347, the rats had already prepared the ground. Their fleas carried the deadly bacterium Yersinia pestis, and when those fleas bit humans, devastation followed. Within a few short years, as much as 1/3 of Europe's population was gone. Entire villages were abandoned, fields lay untended, and cities emptied as death stalked the streets. But behind the priest's prayers, the doctor's failures, and the mourner's wails, the true couriers of death scuttled in silence. Rats had turned local suffering into continental catastrophe. This power was not limited to disease. Rats influenced trade and empire in subtler ways, too. Grain was a currency of survival, and controlling it was the key to wealth. Yet rats always took their share. Merchants calculated losses not only from spoilage and theft, but also from vermin. A voyage across the Mediterranean could see sacks reduced to husks, forcing prices higher upon arrival. The risk of infestation shaped how grain was stored, where ports were built, and which merchants prospered. Armies, too, bowed to the empire of vermin. Campaign journals across centuries describe rats feasting on supplies in camps, spreading disease among troops, and undermining sieges by destroying food stores. A fortress might hold against an enemy army, but not against the relentless gnawing of rodents in its granaries. Victories and defeats alike were shadowed by the smallest of enemies. And yet, for all their destruction, rats revealed truths about humanity itself. They flourished wherever people gathered, feeding on our waste, thriving in our negligence, multiplying in our shadow. Their success was tied to ours. They were not conquerors of cities, but companions of them, following us as faithfully as dogs, though never welcomed. In a sense, rats became mirrors of our own expansion. Stowaways on ships, settlers in new lands, participants in every migration and conquest. Their role as gatekeepers was symbolic, as well as practical. Rats decided who would live and who would starve, whose armies marched and whose faltered, which cities prospered and which fell into ruin. They were not rulers in the sense of thrones and crowns, but they ruled through hunger, disease, and survival, the most fundamental levers of human life. And so, when we look back at medieval cities and imagine their gates guarded by armored soldiers, we should also imagine the rats waiting below, slipping between cobblestones, scurrying through shadows, deciding silently whether the city's future will be one of plenty, pestilence, or ruin. The irony is that while kings were remembered for battles and treaties, and knights for valor and honor, the rats endured, forgotten in the chronicles, but etched into the survival of every family. The true rulers of the medieval city were not crowned. They squeaked in the dark. And so we enter the question: if history's greatest empires could be shaken not by armies but by vermin, what does that say about the forces that still govern us today? The quiet, unseen gatekeepers we choose not to see? When we imagine the collapse of kingdoms, we tend to picture armies clashing, assassins striking, or castles burning. But many kingdoms in Europe and beyond were not undone by battles. They were undone by taxes. Not the great levies that funded crusades or the sweeping tariffs on foreign goods, but the small, grinding taxes that pressed on common people until patience snapped. Take, for example, the hearth tax, a levy imposed not on wealth or land, but on the simple fact of having a fire in your home. In medieval England and France, kings desperate for revenue turned to this tax, reasoning that every household had a hearth, and therefore every household could pay. It was a simple, boring, predictable source of income, but what rulers saw as a steady stream of pennies, the people saw as intrusion into the most sacred part of their lives, the hearth, the center of warmth, food, and family. To enforce the hearth tax, officials had to count the number of hearths in each home. This meant entering people's houses, prying into private spaces, and tallying stoves and chimneys. In an era when privacy was limited but fiercely valued, this felt like humiliation. It was not simply that the tax was costly. It was that it required strangers to step into the most intimate corners of life. And this was only one example. Medieval Europe was littered with taxes that today seem almost absurd. Taxes on salt, on windows, on candles, on mills, even on the grinding of grain. Each was small on its own, but together they became suffocating. Salt taxes in France, known as a gabelle, became especially notorious. Salt was essential, not just for seasoning but for preserving food. To tax, it was to tax survival itself. The gabelle lasted for centuries, breeding resentment that smoldered until it helped fuel the French Revolution. In the short term, these taxes seemed clever. Kings needed money for wars, palaces, or debts, and small levies on daily necessities added up quickly. But rulers forgot the psychology of taxation. People will bear great burdens in times of war if they believe the cause is just, but they will not tolerate endless irritation in times of peace, especially when it touches their kitchens and tables. The forgotten taxes cut deepest because they struck where life was most ordinary. A nobleman might complain about losing land to the crown, but he still ate well. A peasant family, however, who saw their bread shrink because flour was taxed at the mill, or who shivered through winter because a hearth tax made fuel unaffordable, they carried the true weight of discontent. And history shows that it was not always the grand campaigns or the rival dynasties that destroyed kingdoms. Often, it was a slow drip of resentment, the quiet anger at petty levies, the sense that rulers cared more for coin than for subjects. The records of the time are filled with petitions, complaints, and uprisings that began not with the cry of liberty, but with the cry of exhaustion. Enough. No more taxes. In some cases, kings yielded, repealing the most hated levies. In others, they clung stubbornly until resistance turned to riot and riot to rebellion. But here lies a quiet irony. The collapse of kingdoms often began not with swords at the gate, but with pennies at the hearth. And so we ask, was it truly the armies that toppled kings, or the taxes so small, so boring, that rulers forgot how heavy they felt in the hands of the people? If the hearth tax revealed the intrusion of rulers into the private lives of households, the salt tax revealed something far more dangerous: the taxation of survival itself. In medieval and early modern France, salt was not luxury. It was necessity. Long before refrigeration, salt was the only reliable way to preserve meat, fish, or vegetables. Without it, a family could not last through winter. Salt was sprinkled on everything, not for taste, but for survival. And so, when French monarchs imposed a gabelle, a tax on salt, they were not taxing comfort or wealth, but life itself. The gabelle was more than just a surcharge. It was a system. Citizens were not free to buy salt wherever they wished. They were required to purchase it from royal warehouses at inflated prices. This meant two things. First, the crown grew rich. Second, the poor grew furious. For centuries, resentment simmered. Smuggling salt became a common trade, entire families participating in illicit runs to avoid the gabelle. In some regions, salt smuggling was so widespread that it became a shadow economy, with communities protecting their own against royal enforcers. The anger never truly died down, and by the 18th century, it boiled over. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, the salt tax was one of the grievances shouted loudest by the starving crowds. The gabelle was not merely unpopular. It was a symbol of everything wrong with monarchy. A government that taxed survival had forfeited its right to rule. Meanwhile, across the Channel, England had its own tax controversies. The hearth tax, introduced in 1662, seemed at first like a clever idea. Every home had a hearth, and so the tax would be fair, spreading evenly across the population. But fairness on paper is not fairness in practice. For the poor, even a small payment for each hearth was crushing. And worse, collecting the tax meant officials entering homes, counting stoves and chimneys, and peering into private spaces. It was invasive, humiliating, and resented by all classes. The English hearth tax was so hated that it became known as the chimney money. For decades, people complained bitterly, evaded payments, or bricked up hearths to reduce their liability. By the time it was finally abolished in 1689, its legacy was clear. The tax had bred not loyalty but contempt, not revenue but resistance. These cases illustrate a larger truth about taxation in the medieval and early modern world. It was not always the heaviest taxes that broke kingdoms, but the ones that felt most unjust. A levy on trade, a fee for nobles, or a duty on luxuries could be endured. But a tax on the hearth, the family's fire, or on salt, the family's survival, was intolerable. And yet, rulers often ignored these signs. desperate for funds to fight wars or pay debts, they clung to the very taxes that undermined their own stability. Kings gambled that the people's anger would never rise to rebellion. Sometimes they were right, but when they were wrong, the consequences were catastrophic. The echoes of these forgotten taxes stretched beyond their immediate time. They revealed a delicate balance between ruler and ruled, the fine line between revenue and revolt. For in the end, it was not the mighty armies or the grand castles that determined survival, but whether the pennies demanded at the hearth or the handfuls of salt taken at the market could be borne without breaking. And so the question deepens. How many kingdoms fell not because their armies lost battles, but because their rulers taxed daily life until the people refused to live under them at all? By the time the 17th and 18th centuries dawned, Europe was a patchwork of kings and parliaments, dukes and bishops, all seeking revenue to fund their wars, courts, and ambitions. Yet as powerful as these rulers seemed, their survival was often balanced on the thinnest of ledgers. Taxes were their lifeblood, and taxes, as history shows, were also their downfall. What made the so-called boring taxes so dangerous was not their size, but their intimacy. They touched daily life in ways that felt personal. A tariff on foreign wine was resented by merchants, but most peasants hardly noticed. A levy on hearths, however, forced its way into the family's most private space. A tax on salt turned every meal into a reminder of royal intrusion. These were not distant financial burdens. They were immediate, unavoidable irritations that accumulated until patience wore thin. France offers the clearest example of how such levies could snowball into revolution. By the late 18th century, the gabelle had become more than a tax. It was a symbol of tyranny. The crown clung to it stubbornly, even as smuggling, resentment, and open defiance grew. Peasants had contraband salt in carts, barns, even children's clothing. Communities protected smugglers, sometimes more fiercely than they obeyed the king's officials. Every bag of illegal salt carried across the countryside was both a necessity and a rebellion. When famine and economic crisis struck in the 1780s, the salt tax became unbearable. People were starving, yet still forced to pay inflated prices for the very mineral that preserved their food. The revolution that exploded in 1789 was fueled by many grievances, but the gabelle was among the most despised. When the monarchy fell, the salt tax fell with it, proof that the most boring levy could carry revolutionary weight. England's hearth tax tells a parallel story, though on a smaller scale. Instituted in 1662, it lasted less than 3 decades before its abolition in 1689. But in that short span, it bred deep distrust of government. People who once tolerated taxation as a necessity of monarchy now viewed it as an invasion of their homes. The hearth tax was a quiet teacher, reminding subjects that even small intrusions could be resisted, and that rulers who pressed too far into daily life risked legitimacy itself. The larger pattern is clear. Small taxes, poorly managed, became rallying cries. The English peasants' revolt of 1381, though sparked by the poll tax, shared the same logic. People rose not only because of the financial burden, but because the tax felt unjust, targeted, and degrading. Across Europe, tax collectors became the most hated figures in villages and towns, symbols not of law but of oppression. What makes these forgotten taxes remarkable is how modern they feel. The salt tax, the hearth tax, the poll tax, all were essentially regressive levies, falling hardest on the poor while the wealthy found ways to evade or soften the blow. The resentment they bred was not just economic, but moral. People can endure hardship if it is shared. They revolt when they believe hardship is unfairly distributed. In that sense, the collapse of kingdoms over boring taxes teaches us profound truth. Power is not sustained by armies or castles alone, but by trust. Once that trust is broken, when the people see rulers taking from their tables their fires, their survival itself, no throne is safe. And so, when we look back at medieval and early modern Europe, we should not only see knights and kings, crusades and coronations. We should see the coins drop reluctantly into the hands of tax collectors, the salt smuggled through forests at night, the hearth counted and recounted by suspicious officials. For it was in these small, daily humiliations that kingdoms began to crack. The irony is sharp. Kings may have feared invasion, but it was the penny tax, the salt levy, the chimney money that often proved deadlier than any army. And so we are left with a thought that lingers beyond history. If kingdoms once collapsed because rulers taxed salt and fire, then what quiet levies in our own lives might one day spark the same kind of reckoning? Imagine a medieval night. The sun has slipped beyond the horizon, and with it, most of the world's activity. Darkness is not simply the absence of light. It is a presence, thick and heavy, pressing against every window and spilling through every crack. For most people, this darkness was inescapable. They went to bed early, not out of choice, but because to stay awake was costly. To keep darkness at bay required fire, and fire required candles. Today, we strike a match and summon light without a thought. But for medieval families, the humble candle was a treasure. It was labor, material, and privilege rolled into one. A single candle could represent hours of work, days of saving, or the wealth of a noble household. And in some moments of scarcity, a candle's worth approached that of gold. Candles were made from different substances, and each told a story of status. The poor burned tallow candles, made from animal fat. These smoked, stank, and sputtered, filling rooms with a greasy haze. They provided light, but only grudgingly. The wealthy, by contrast, lit beeswax candles, golden, clean, long-burning, and fragrant. These were not merely tools but luxuries, symbols of refinement. In cathedrals, their glow seemed holy. In castles, they glittered at banquets. In peasants' cottages, by contrast, their absence was a reminder of poverty. The work of producing candles was itself a small industry. Tallow had to be rendered, poured, cooled, and shaped. Beeswax had to be collected carefully from hives, an expensive and dangerous task. In both cases, labor and scarcity pushed prices high. A family might manage only a few tallow candles a month, saving them for winter nights, festivals, or emergencies. This scarcity meant that time itself was shaped by candles. Without them, people lived by the rhythm of the sun. Work began at dawn and ended at dusk. Night was for sleep, not activity. Only the rich could afford to stretch time into the evening, hosting feasts, reading manuscripts, or planning wars under the steady glow of wax. The ability to control the night was thus not universal. It was stratified, divided by wealth. Consider also the role of the church. Cathedrals consumed vast numbers of candles, their altars lined with flickering flames. Each candle represented both piety and expense, purchased by donations from the faithful. For many, offering a candle was a form of prayer, a way to make devotion visible. Yet behind the symbolism was cold economics. The more candles burned in a cathedral, the more wealth flowed into the coffers that supplied them. Light, in this sense, became a business. The symbolic value of candles extended beyond churches. A candle burning in a window could mark hospitality, safety, or warning. Guilds and households used them in rituals. Lovers courted by candlelight. Judges and scribes worked by them late into the night. Each flame was more than illumination. It was power, both literal and metaphorical. But scarcity had consequences. Wars and famines could drive candle prices so high that even the wealthy rationed their use. Records survive of merchants noting that in certain regions, beeswax was priced weight for weight alongside gold. Imagine that. A lump of wax drawn from the labor of bees, rivaling the most prized metal kings. In those moments, the simple act of lighting a room became an act of luxury, as unattainable for some as jewels or silks. The candle, then, was not merely a tool of light. It was a measure of wealth, a regulator of time, and a gatekeeper of privilege. To own light was to own hours. To lack it was to surrender half your life to darkness. And so the question flickers before us. If night could be bought and sold by the inch of a candle, then who truly controlled time in the medieval world? The rising sun, or those who could afford to keep it burning long after dusk? Behind every flickering flame of a medieval candle was an entire chain of labor, regulation, and power. Light was not simply produced. It was managed, taxed, and often restricted. In a world where scarcity shaped survival, the candle became both commodity and currency. The production of candles was guarded by guilds, powerful organizations of craftsmen who controlled quality, pricing, and access to the trade. In many cities, candle making was split between two groups: the chandlers, who work with tallow, and the wax chandlers, who handle beeswax. The difference between the two was not merely material, but social. Tallow chandlers supplied the poor. Their goods smoked and sputtered in cottages. Wax chandlers supplied the church, the nobility, and the wealthy, their products glowing in cathedrals and banquets. This division meant that light itself became stratified. The poor lived in shadows, their homes dim and hazy, while the rich enjoyed steady, golden light. In some cases, ordinances even forbade the use of wax candles outside churches or noble households, reinforcing the divide. The sight of a beeswax candle in a peasant's home was rare and often temporary, reserved for weddings, funerals, or holy days. Scarcity drove prices skyward. Beeswax, difficult to harvest and in limited supply, could cost many times more than tallow. To secure beeswax required access to hives, often controlled by monasteries or large estates. Peasants who kept bees were pressured to sell their wax to guilds or lords, leaving little for themselves. The wealthy monopolized the best light, while the poor scraped by with stinking tallow that dripped and guttered, reminding them with every puff of smoke of their place in the social order. Even tallow, though cheaper, carried its burdens. It required slaughtering animals, boiling fat, and endless hours of labor. The smell was pungent, clinging to workshops and streets. Candle makers were often pushed to the margins of towns, their craft tolerated but resented. Yet without them, entire cities would be plunged into darkness. The economics of light extended into taxation. Rulers quickly recognized that candles were unavoidable for anyone who wished to extend the day. Some levied duties on tallow, others on beeswax, and in certain cases, even on the sale of finished candles. What seems trivial to us, a penny here, a farthing there, became crushing over time. A family already struggling to afford grain now faced another quiet expense just to keep a single flame alive in the evening. But light was not only taxed, it was rationed. In monasteries, the number of candles lit at night was strictly regulated to conserve supplies. In towns, households rationed their own stock carefully. Many families saved their best candles for the darkest depths of winter or for religious feasts. To light a candle casually was considered wasteful, almost sinful, a sign of wealth flaunted in a world where most lived in shadow. The lack of light shaped entire communities. Work days ended with dusk, unless one belonged to a household rich enough to afford extended hours. The poor rose and slept with the sun, their lives dictated by nature's cycle. The rich, by contrast, bent time itself, holding councils, copying manuscripts, or hosting revelries long into the night. Light created privilege, not abstractly, but in the simple fact of having more hours in a day. Candles also became central to ritual and symbolism. A single beeswax taper offered at a church altar was both prayer and payment, binding faith to economy. Guilds marked processions with candlelight, a display not only of piety, but of wealth. Weddings, funerals, and coronations all blazed with flames that spoke louder than words. Light was honor, devotion, and status, and behind every flicker was cost. For the poor, candlelight was more memory than reality. A child might remember a single candle burning at Christmas, or at the bedside of a dying relative. These rare moments imprinted themselves deeply, making the presence of light sacred precisely because it was fleeting. Darkness was the rule, light was the exception. And so the medieval candle economy was not just about wax and wick. It was about who owned the night, who could stretch the day, who could work, pray, or revel after dusk. A candle was not a tool. It was permission, purchased inch by inch, flame by flame. Which raises a question. If light itself could be hoarded, rationed, and taxed, then did candles not illuminate more than rooms? Did they also reveal the true balance of power in society? For medieval people, candles were more than objects. They were experiences, symbols, and sometimes even miracles. The flicker of a flame could transform an ordinary room into something sacred. And because candles were scarce, each one carried weight far beyond its wick. To light a candle was to declare purpose, privilege, or prayer. In the great cathedrals of Europe, candles filled entire spaces with shimmering light. Rows of beeswax tapers blazed at altars. Their golden glow meant to represent the eternal light of God. Parishioners brought candles as offerings, not because the church needed more wax, but because each flame was a visible sign of devotion. To burn a candle was to carry your prayers heavenward. The smoke and light together formed a bridge between the earthly and the divine. This symbolism was not confined to religion. Monarchs, too, understood the power of light. Royal feasts glittered with candles in golden holders. The sheer abundance of flame announcing wealth to all who attended. Ambassadors and guests did not need to be told of a king's power. They could see it in the hundreds of candles burning at once, each one consuming wax worth more than a peasant could afford in a month. Owning light meant owning time. Monks illuminated manuscripts in scriptoriums late into the night, their work only possible through the glow of carefully rationed beeswax. Nobles met in candlelit chambers to discuss politics while peasants slept in darkness. Scholars studied, writers wrote, and councils conspired long after commoners had surrendered to the rhythm of the sun. Power did not sleep when the sun set, but only because the powerful could afford to keep the night at bay. The scarcity of light also shaped culture. Folklore often described night as a realm of danger, spirits, and fear. To step outside after dark without a lantern was to risk misfortune. Stories of ghosts, witches, and demons flourish in part because the world beyond the hearth was literally unseen. Candles gave safety, both physical and psychological. Their glow defined the boundary between the known and the unknown. Yet, candles were fragile. A single draft could extinguish them, plunging a room into darkness. Entire gatherings could end abruptly if supplies ran out. The dependency on wax and tallow underscored how precarious life was. Light was not a guarantee. It was borrowed, temporary, and expensive. Wars and famines made this fragility even sharper. In times of crisis, beeswax might be hoarded, its value rising until it was traded weight for weight with precious metals. A candle burning at such times was both necessity and extravagance, its flame illuminating not only a room but the gulf between rich and poor. But perhaps the most remarkable legacy of medieval candles is how they prepared the way for the modern world. The struggle for light, to make it cheaper, steadier, more abundant, drove innovation. Oil lamps improved, gaslight followed, and eventually electricity conquered the night entirely. What once cost a family dearly can now be summoned with the flick of a switch. And yet, the symbolism lingers. We still light candles in churches, at vigils, on birthdays. We still treat flame as sacred, even in an age of abundance. The story of candles reminds us that the fight for survival is not always about food or war. Sometimes it is about light, about stretching the day, controlling the night, and claiming power over time itself. And so we are left with this reflection. If a candle once carried the weight of gold, what does our cheap, endless light hide from us now? And what will we see if darkness returned? When we picture Rome, we often see marble columns, armored legions, and emperors draped in purple. But beneath the glory of empire, beneath the iron of armor and the weight of shields, there was leather, Roman shoes, the caligae of the soldiers, the sandals of citizens, the hobnailed soles that echoed across stone roads, with a foundation on which Rome walked, marched, and conquered. To understand their importance, imagine the scale of Rome's ambition. Its armies did not defend small kingdoms. They spanned continents. A legion might be ordered to march 20 miles a day for weeks on end, crossing mountains, rivers, and plains. Roads helped, but without shoes, those miles would break men long before battles began. The caliga, the Roman military boot sandal, was not glamorous, but it was essential. The design was deceptively simple. Thick leather soles, reinforced with iron hobnails, strapped securely with leather thongs that wrapped around the ankle and calf. The open design allowed ventilation, preventing the rot and infection that plagued later soldiers in closed boots. The hobnails gave grip and durability, biting into soil and stone alike. A legionary's caligae could last hundreds of miles before wearing thin, and even then could be repaired with fresh nails and straps. This durability mattered because Rome's power was mobility. Armies that could move faster, farther, and longer than their enemies had the advantage. A soldier without good shoes was not a soldier at all. Campaign journals, supply lists, and archaeological finds all testify to the centrality of footwear. Entire convoys of carts carried spare leather, nails, and tools for repair. Cobbler soldiers were as vital to an army's survival as blacksmiths. But shoes did more than carry armies. They carried identity. Roman footwear varied by class and status, marking out senators, equestrians, citizens, and slaves. The elite wore red-dyed shoes, their color a symbol of power. Citizens wore more modest designs, while slaves often went barefoot, their lack of shoes a visible marker of servitude. To wear shoes was to walk within the order of Rome itself. In daily life, shoes revealed both wealth and geography. Urban dwellers preferred softer leather shoes, suited to paved streets and villas. Farmers wore sturdier sandals, their soles hardened by constant use in fields. In colder provinces, Romans adapted with closed boots lined with fur. The empire's reach meant that footwear itself became a map, shaped by climate, culture, and class. The economic weight of shoes was immense. Leather had to be tanned, processed, and cut. Nails had to be forged. Workshops of cobblers thrived in cities, supplying citizens and soldiers alike. Shoes were bought, repaired, resold, and handed down. A legionary's kit always included extra hobnails, for without them his shoes and his ability to march were useless. And yet, shoes were fragile. A single stone could rip a strap. A day of rain could warp leather. A missing nail could wear down a sole. Soldiers knew the importance of constant inspection, of tending their shoes as carefully as their weapons. A sword might decide a moment of battle, but shoes decided whether a soldier reached the battlefield at all. Shoes also carried symbolism. The very sound of hobnailed sandals on Roman roads became a sound of authority. Towns heard the clatter, and knew Rome was present. To hear the march of Caligula was to hear empire itself moving, steady, unyielding, unstoppable. But behind the clatter and the leather was a question few asked. How much of Rome's greatness rested not on marble and iron, but on the humble shoe that carried it all? An empire is not held together by statues or speeches. It is held together by supply. Grain for stomachs, iron for weapons, leather for shoes. And in Rome's vast machine, footwear was as essential as swords. The Roman military system was nothing if not meticulous. A legion of 5,000 men needed not only weapons and armor, but tens of thousands of nails and countless strips of leather to keep their shoes in order. Archaeological digs at military camps reveal pits filled with discarded saws and piles of worn hobnails, evidence of just how quickly soldiers wore through their gear. To prevent disaster, Rome built an entire infrastructure around footwear. Cobble workshops existed within camps, staffed by soldiers trained in leatherwork. These men resoled, stitched, and nailed shoes as part of their daily duties. The army carried portable forges to produce nails, and convoys of mules hauled leather across provinces. If swords rusted, soldiers could still fight. If shoes fell apart, they could not march. Rome knew this truth well. The importance of footwear is visible in the empire's obsession with roads. The famous Roman roads, paved with stone and engineered for centuries of use, were not only marvels of engineering, but also a direct response to the needs of hobnailed sandals. Roads extended the life of shoes, reduced wear, and allowed faster marching. In a sense, the roads and the shoes existed in a symbiotic relationship. One was useless without the other. Shoes also had economic consequences. Rome required vast amounts of leather, and tanning became a major industry. Tanneries, often located outside cities because of their foul smells, processed hides into the thick soles soldiers needed. Entire provinces contributed hides, from cattle in Gaul to goats in North Africa. The empire's appetite for leather was endless, and like grain or iron, it moved along trade routes guarded by soldiers whose own shoes depended on its delivery. But the system was not foolproof. Campaigns sometimes faltered not because of lost battles, but because of failing supplies. Accounts survive of legions slowed by shortages of shoes, their men forced to march barefoot across rough terrain. Without hobnails, soles wore down in days, leaving soldiers limping, bleeding, and unfit for combat. In such cases, commanders might halt entire armies to resupply or strip local villages of leather. The failure to keep men shod could undo years of planning. Shoes were also psychological armor. A soldier who heard the steady clatter of hobnailed sandals knew his unit was strong, disciplined, moving as one. A soldier whose shoes fell apart felt vulnerable, unprepared, and exposed. The difference between confidence and despair could be measured in leather straps and iron nails. The importance of cobblers even shaped rank and duty. While some soldiers trained in specialized weapons or engineering, others were tasked with shoemaking. These men were not celebrated in triumphal processions, but without them, triumphs could not be won. Every victory carved into marble owed part of its glory to nameless craftsmen who hammered nails into soles in muddy camps. And so, the Roman shoe was more than leather and iron. It was infrastructure, industry, and survival. An empire that could clothe its legions in sandals could move across continents. An empire that failed would stumble, quite literally, into defeat. But here lies the unsettling question. If Rome's legions marched farther and fought harder because of shoes, then how much of empire itself was built not on strategy or valor, but on the strength of leather beneath their feet? The story of Rome is written not only in marble ruins and military triumphs, but also in footprints, literal ones, pressed into soil, stone, and history by the countless sandals of its legions. Long after swords rusted and empires crumbled, the mark of Roman shoes endured, a quiet reminder that even the greatest civilizations stand on the smallest of things. Archaeology has preserved this truth vividly. In Britain, Germany, and North Africa, entire collections of Roman shoes have been unearthed from wells, camps, and graves. Some are sturdy caligae with their soles studded by hobnails. Others are delicate sandals worn by women and children in provincial towns. Together, they reveal a society where footwear was not an afterthought, but a cornerstone of daily life. Soldiers, farmers, nobles, and slaves all left their traces in leather and iron. Roman shoes carried symbolism as well as function. The sound of hobnailed sandals striking stone became a sound of authority, the audible announcement of Rome's presence. Townsfolk did not need to see soldiers to know they were coming. They could hear them. The rhythm of marching shoes was as much a weapon as the glint of a spear. In literature, too, shoes often appeared as shorthand for status. The red shoes of senators, the plain sandals of citizens, the bare feet of slaves. Rome walked in hierarchy as much as it did in leather. Yet the significance of Roman shoes extended beyond Rome itself. When the empire fell, its footwear designs lingered. Medieval armies adopted hobnailed soles for durability, while peasant and farmers used variations of Roman sandals for fieldwork. Even today, the modern military boot traces its lineage back to the caliga, proof that the lessons of Roman cobblers outlasted emperors. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Roman shoes was the simple idea that mobility was power. Rome conquered because it could move. Its armies crossed mountains, deserts, and rivers, often faster and farther than its enemies could imagine. That mobility rested on countless soles of leather, repaired endlessly, carried faithfully, and discarded silently at the side of roads that still exist today. Every Roman road, stretching narrow straight across Europe, is also a monument to shoes. The humble footwear also carried cultural meaning in Rome's decline. When emperors grew decadent, critics accused them of losing the discipline of their ancestors, of trading the hardy caligae for soft slippers, symbols of weakness and luxury. Shoes, in this sense, became metaphors for Rome itself. Strong when studded and worn on the march, fragile when delicate and confined to palaces. And beyond Rome, the story is almost poetic. Leather rots, hobnails rust, shoes vanish into the soil. And yet, their absence is itself a presence, reminding us that history is not carried only in monuments, but in the mundane objects that once bore the weight of human lives. So, the long road of Roman shoes was more than a path of leather and iron. It was a road of empire, a reminder that no matter how grand the ambition, success often rests on details so ordinary that history almost forgets them. And so we end with this reflection. If the Roman Empire could rise and march on shoes, then what small, unnoticed things carried away to our own world today? Imagine the deck of a medieval or early modern ship at night. The sun has long since slipped into the horizon, leaving only the faint light of stars and the creak of timber. The air is heavy with salt, damp with spray, and filled with the restless groans of vessel always in motion. For the sailors, sleep is not rest but negotiation, and ropes are as vital as pillows. The ocean is never still. Even on calm nights, ships rolled and pitched, their decks tilting at odd angles. In storms, the world became chaos. Waves crashed over planks, water pooled in corners, and masts groaned like tortured giants. To fall asleep on anchor was to risk rolling across the deck, striking timbers, or worse, sliding into the sea. Sailors knew this well. Men had vanished overnight, swept silently into black water, their absence discovered only at dawn. To guard against this, sailors tied themselves with ropes, coarse hemp cords, looped around waists or wrists, anchored them to rails, beams, or even each other. A rope was not comfortable. It bit into flesh, pressed against ribs, and left bruises, but it kept a man alive. To wake still aboard the ship was better than comfort. This practice was more than precaution. It was survival. Ships were cramped, and hammocks were not yet common in European navies until the 16th century. Sailors often slept on bare planks, nestled between cargo or cannons, exposed to spray and wind. A rope was both seatbelt and lifeline, a crude insurance policy against the ocean's hunger. The sea itself dictated this habit. Sailors lived in constant tension with the elements. Rain soaked clothes that never dried. Storms struck without warning, tearing sails and shattering masts. Even in calm weather, the ship rolled endlessly, like a cradle that threatened to throw out its child. On such a stage, sleep was always dangerous. The rope gave the illusion of safety, if not the reality. But ropes served another purpose. They bound sailors to the ship in more ways than one. Life at sea was harsh, discipline brutal, and conditions miserable. The rope was not only around their waists at night. It was in the lash of the boatswain's whip by day. Sailors lived and died by hemp, tied, punished, or saved by it. To sleep in ropes was a reminder that their lives were tethered literally to wood and cordage on the endless sea. Accounts from travelers and chroniclers describe the practice vividly. Sailors lashed themselves to the deck during storms, some even sleeping sitting up, backs pressed against barrels, ropes knotted tight to keep them from sliding. In extreme cases, men tied themselves in groups, sharing strength against the ship's motion. If one shifted, the others held him in place. In such ways, camaraderie and survival were literally bound together. The practice was not foolproof. Accidents still happened. A man might wake strangled by his own knot, or dragged painfully when the ship lurched. But the alternative, to trust the sea with your body as you slept, was worse. For the sailor, sleep was never sanctuary. It was another battlefield, another compromise with danger. The rope around his waist was a reminder that the sea, even when silent, was never safe. And so we are left with a haunting question. When men tied themselves down to sleep, were they protecting their lives, or admitting that on the ocean they were never truly free? By the late Middle Ages and into the early modern era, ships grew larger, voyages longer, and the need for safer sleeping arrangements more urgent. The rope around a sailor's waist, crude though it was, eventually gave way to one of history's simplest yet most transformative inventions, the hammock. But before hammocks became standard, sailors endured conditions that bordered on inhuman. On merchant ships, men often slept wherever they found space, between barrels of cargo, atop coils of rope, or pressed against cannon carriages. In warships, the chaos was worse. Crews were packed by the hundreds into stinking holds, where light was scarce, air was foul, and privacy non-existent. Rats scurried over sleeping bodies. Water dripped constantly from timbers above. Disease thrived in the damp, crowded dark. Sleep itself became a privilege of rank. Officers enjoyed cabins with bunks, curtains, and sometimes even feather mattresses brought from shore. Captains dined and slept in quarters paneled with wood, lit by lanterns, their beds wide enough to stretch. The common sailor, by contrast, curled like an animal on planks that shifted with every wave. This division reinforced the rigid hierarchy of life at sea. Even in rest, the officer ruled while the sailor endured. It was the Spanish and Portuguese navies that first adopted hammocks in the 15th century, learning the practice from indigenous peoples of the Caribbean who had long used them. The hammock solved multiple problems at once. Suspended between beams, it swayed with the ship, reducing the rolling that once sent men sliding across decks. It kept sailors off damp, filthy floors and away from rats and insects. It also saved space, since hammocks could be stowed during the day, leaving room for work and drills. By the 16th century, hammocks spread across European navies. The English and French adopted them, though not without resistance. Some officers believed hammocks made men soft, too comfortable for the harsh life of the sea. Others feared they would make sailors sleep too deeply to respond in emergencies. But in time, practicality won out. Hammocks reduced sickness, preserved discipline, and kept men alive. Yet even hammocks could not erase hierarchy. Officers often rejected them, preferring fixed beds and cabins. The hammock became a sailor's bed, just as tallow candle became the poor man's light. It symbolized both adaptation and division. To swing in a hammock was to be practical and expendable. To sleep in a bunk was a command. Discipline infused even rest. Hammocks were numbered and inspected. Each sailor had a strict space, allotted in inches, and failure to stow a hammock properly could lead to punishment. At sea, order extended into sleep itself. The rope that once tied sailors to the deck was replaced by regulations that tied them to rules. And still, danger remained. In storms, hammocks could swing violently, throwing men into beams. In battle, cannon fire turned them into death traps, splinters and shot tearing through rows of sleeping bodies. Worse, in case of fire, hammocks became fuel, spreading flames with terrifying speed. Sailors were sometimes ordered to throw them overboard during emergencies, sacrificing comfort for survival. The hammock also carried a darker association: death. At sea, when a sailor died, his hammock was often his shroud. The body was sewn into canvas, sometimes with the last stitch through the nose to ensure the man was truly dead, before being slid into the sea. Thus, every sailor who climbed into his hammock at night knew that it might one day carry him to the depths. Still, hammocks represented progress, a fragile victory against the ocean's hostility. They gave sailors something closer to rest, something safer than ropes on planks. Yet they also reinforced the truth that at sea, nothing came without cost. Even sleep required discipline, order, and constant awareness that the sea claimed everything in the end. And so the question lingers: if sailors bound themselves in life to sleep and in death to burial, were hammocks truly beds of rest, or reminders that a sailor was always one knot away from a sea's embrace? For the sailor, sleep was never freedom. It was always a bargain with the sea, a gamble played in darkness. Whether tied down with ropes or swinging in hammocks, men aboard ship never truly surrendered to slumber. They lived in a twilight state, half resting, half alert, always listening for the creak of timber, the snap of rope, the shout of alarm. This uneasy sleep shaped not only their bodies, but their culture, their faith, and their fears. Sailors built superstitions around the fragility of rest. To whistle at night was said to summon storms. So men lay in silence, fearful that even a stray breath might anger the sea. To dream of falling was a bad omen, a premonition of drowning. Some sailors believed that restless dreams meant the ship herself was uneasy, her timbers groaning not just from waves, but from unseen spirits. The line between natural danger and supernatural fear blurred in the hours of darkness. Songs softened the tension. Sea shanties, though mostly work songs, sometimes became lullabies of exhaustion. Men hummed low tunes to steady their minds as the ship rocked them like unwilling children in their hammocks. In the rare quiet of calm seas, the sound of creaking wood and faint singing blended into a strange peace. Yet even then, peace was fragile. A sudden gust, a shouted order, the crash of waves. Sleep could be ripped away in an instant. The constant disruption bred a peculiar psychology. Sailors grew accustomed to living in fragments of time, catching minutes of rest rather than hours. Their bodies adapted, learning to sleep in bursts, waking ready for work at any bell. It was said that seasoned sailors would fall asleep anywhere, on wet planks, beside roaring cannons, even standing against a mast, because exhaustion had trained them to grasp whatever sliver of rest they could. But the darker truth was that many never escaped fatigue. Illness, accidents, and mistakes often followed sleepless nights. A sailor might misjudge a knot, slip on a wet deck, or stumble during a climb. Small errors that the sea punished with merciless swiftness. In this way, sleeplessness itself became another killer, as deadly as storm or shot. The rituals of sleep mirrored the rituals of death. Hammocks, as noted, became burial shrouds. Sailors sewed their fellows into canvas, weighted them with shot, and slid them into the deep. To lie in one's hammock at night was to feel that proximity to the sea's claim. Some whispered prayers before drifting off, treating every sleep as if it might be their last. Even in port, when land offered safer beds, the habits of the sea lingered. Sailors often slept lightly, waking at sounds others ignored. Some tied ropes across their chests even in taverns or inns, their bodies so trained to feel restraint that they could not rest without it. The sea had rewired them, binding their dreams forever to its motion. And yet, amid this hardship, a strange resilience grew. Sailors laughed at their misery, mocked their hammocks as sacks of bones, and spun stories of men snoring so loudly they drowned out storms. Humor became survival, a way of turning fatigue into fellowship. In the darkness, bound by ropes or cradled in hammocks, sailors found not comfort but solidarity. They endured together, half awake, half dreaming, fully alive only because they held on to each other and the ship. The sailor's rope, then, was never just rope. It was safety, restraint, discipline, and fate. It tethered men to wood, to life, and to one another. It carried them through storms, through nights of fear, through the endless uncertainty of the ocean. And so we are left to wonder, if sailors slept bound by ropes, never free even in their dreams, was the sea their master, or was it their own resilience, their refusal to let go, that truly kept them afloat? History often glorifies battles, the clash of swords, the brilliance of generals, the heroism of soldiers. Yet many of history's most decisive moments were not won by men at all, but by terrain and often by mud. That thick, sticky, treacherous substance has swallowed wagons, broken armies, and undone the ambitions of emperors. Imagine a medieval or early modern army on the march. Thousands of men trudge along, armored and weary. Horses strain under knights, and wagons groan beneath supplies. Ahead lies the enemy. But between here and there lies a rain-soaked field, a forest path churned to mire, or a riverbank after flood. Boots sink ankle-deep. Wheels jam. Animals flounder. What was meant to be a march of hours becomes a crawl of days. Fatigue mounts. Supplies dwindle. The enemy waits. Mud was more than inconvenience. It was a silent saboteur. An army's strength depended on movement, the ability to bring troops, food, and weapons to the right place at the right time. Mud stripped away that advantage. Horses, the very engine of medieval warfare, were especially vulnerable. A knight's warhorse, clad in iron barding, might weigh half a ton. In dry fields, it was unstoppable. In mud, it became a liability, sinking, stumbling, collapsing under its own weight. A knight unhorsed in mud was less a warrior than a prisoner, struggling to stand while enemies closed in. Wagons fared no better. Heavy carts carrying grain, fodder, and siege equipment sank until their axles touched muck. Teams of oxen strained in vain, hooves slipping, ropes snapping. Soldiers pressed their shoulders to wheels, cursing, groaning, sinking deep of themselves. To abandon a wagon was to abandon supplies, a slow death sentence for an army dependent on bread and fodder. Yet often, abandon them they did, leaving behind broken carts half buried like bones in the earth. Mud also killed morale. A soldier might endure hunger, fear, or wounds of victory seemed near. But endless days of slogging through mire, soaked to the bone, dragging equipment that refused to move, could break spirits. Mud turned proud legions into stumbling crowds, their discipline dissolving with each step. Deserters slipped away, hiding in forests or villages, while commanders fumed at terrain they could not command. Perhaps most devastating was Mud's ability to strip away strategy. A general might plan brilliant maneuvers, but if the field became a swamp, cavalry charges stalled, infantry formations broke apart, and siege engines never arrived. Battles were lost not to superior tactics, but to soil and rain. We think of mud as dull, a background detail of weather. But for armies, it was an enemy, faceless, formless, relentless. It punished overconfidence, humbled kings, and turned triumph into disaster. More than once, mud has stood where soldiers could not, barring the path of empire. And so we are left with a question. How many empires fell not to the sword of the enemy, but to the quiet weight of the ground beneath their own feet? If mud was a constant companion of armies, it was also their most unpredictable foe. Generals could predict the movement of enemies, but they could not command the rain. And time after time, it was not steel or fire that broke campaigns, but the ground itself. Take the Low Countries, the flat, waterlogged lands of medieval Flanders. Here, countless wars were fought. French kings, Flemish rebels, Burgundian dukes, and later Spanish and Dutch forces all clashed on this sodden stage. Chroniclers describe knights sinking knee-deep in mire, their armor dragging them down until they could barely move. Horses floundered, unable to charge. Infantry slogged so slowly that battles dissolved into chaos. The mud turned shining cavalry into lumbering statues, helpless before lighter-armed peasants and militias. One of the most famous examples was the Battle of Courtrai in 1302, sometimes called the Battle of the Golden Spurs. French knights, clad in heavy armor, charged across marshy ground toward Flemish militias, but the mud betrayed them. Their horses stumbled, their momentum vanished, and the foot soldiers, armed with pikes and disciplined courage, cut them down. The field was littered with fallen nobles, their golden spurs collected as trophies. It was not simply Flemish defiance that won the day, but the swampy soil beneath their feet. Mud's reach extended far beyond the Middle Ages. In the 19th century, Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 is remembered for snow and cold, but before winter came, there was mud. The Russian Rasputitsa, the seasonal quagmire of autumn and spring, turned roads into rivers of muck. French supply wagons sank axle-deep. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Soldiers marched for days, shoes sucked from their feet by the mire. By the time frost hardened the ground, Napoleon's army was already crippled, its supplies scattered, its men starving. A century later, Hitler's armies met the same fate. The German advance into Russia in 1941, like Napoleon before it, slowed to a crawl when the rains came. Tanks, pride of modern mechanized warfare, churned helplessly in bogged-down roads. Trucks carrying fuel and ammunition stalled, their wheels spinning in liquid earth. Soldiers dragged equipment by hand, cursing mud that swallowed boots and froze rifles. Once again, the Rasputitsa defended Russia better than walls or armies. In both cases, mud was not the sole reason for defeat, but it was decisive. Napoleon's Grande Armée, weakened by mire before winter, never recovered. Hitler's Wehrmacht, bogged down before Moscow, lost its momentum, allowing Soviet resistance to regroup. Empires that dreamed of conquest found themselves humbled by mud. Even smaller campaigns fell victim to the same force. Medieval chroniclers tell of sieges abandoned because supply wagons could not cross flooded ground. Knights who set out to raid villages returned empty-handed because rains made roads impassable. Mud did not need to win battles. It only needed to delay them long enough for hunger and fatigue to finish the job. In this way, mud was a true equalizer. It cared nothing for banners or titles. It struck kings and peasants alike. It silenced cavalry charges and neutralized artillery. It turned the proudest armies into stragglers, their discipline dissolving in the sucking, sticky ground. And so, when we look at the grand strategies of history, we must also look at the weathered earth beneath them. For more than once, it was not the brilliance of commander or the courage of soldiers that decided outcomes, but the soil itself, wet, heavy, unyielding. Which raises a question: were the great empires of history undone by enemies at their gates or by the mud beneath their own feet? For all the glory of war, the banners, the cavalry charges, the roar of cannon, the truth is humbler. Armies move on the ground, and the ground decides their fate. In dry summers, dust blinded men and choked horses. In wet seasons, mud swallowed them whole. The greatest generals of history could plot their campaigns with brilliance, but when the skies opened and the soil softened, all plans dissolved. Medieval chronicles are filled with laments about to rain. Sieges timed for summer faltered when rains came early. Raids planned across fertile plains slowed to slogs when harvest fields turned to bogs. Even the mighty castles, symbols of stone permanence, were vulnerable if roads then became impassable. Mud was not only a battlefield problem, it was a logistical one. No food reached besieging armies when wagons sank. No reinforcement arrived when horses could not cross rivers swollen into swamps. Strategists learned to fear the weather more than the enemy. Roman generals, centuries before medieval knights, planned campaigns according to seasons, aware that their famously straight roads were useless if floods turned them into channels of muck. Medieval commanders, less organized but no less aware, timed their marches to avoid the worst rains. Still, ambition often blinded judgment, and armies marched anyway, only to bog down in mire, defeated without an enemy arrow loosed. The irony is sharp. Mud was democratic. It humbled all. Nobles in gilded armor found themselves trapped beside barefoot peasants. Cannons designed to terrify fortresses sat useless in swamps. Kings cursed alongside their men, powerless before the weight of wet soil. Mud did not respect banners, crowns, or empires. It respected only gravity and rain. And yet, mud also shaped innovation. Engineers built raised causeways, corduroy roads of logs, and stone pavements to outweat the earth. Armies learned to carry lighter wagons or march in narrower columns. Fortresses were built near high ground not only for defense, but to ensure supply lines stayed dry. Even today, military strategy respects this ancient truth. The ground itself fights back. The legacy of mud stretches into the modern age. The Russian Rasputitsa that swallowed Napoleon and Hitler remains infamous, a seasonal reminder that the land itself guards its secrets. Modern tanks may seem invincible, but photographs from wars as recent as the 20th and 21st centuries show them mired axle-deep, just as helpless as medieval wagons. Technology may change, but mud remains undefeated. More than anything, mud reminds us of human fragility. Empires rise on grand ambitions. Kings dream of conquest. Generals boast of strategies. Yet all of it can be undone by a week of rain. The fall of armies is not always the work of swords or bullets. Sometimes it is a quiet, sucking pull of earth itself. So when we study history, perhaps we should pay less attention to crowns and banners and more to clouds and soil. For the true general of history is not man, but nature, and mud, silent and stubborn, has claimed more victories than any king. And so we are left with this reflection. If mud could halt knights, emperors, and conquerors alike, then how many of history's greatest ambitions were lost not in battle, but in the quiet way of the ground beneath their feet? Walk through a medieval city, and you will hear the sound long before you see the source. The slosh of water in wooden buckets, the creak of yokes across shoulders, the steady rhythm of feet trudging from well to home, from river to market. These are the sounds of survival, carried daily by water carriers. The invisible workforce that sustained towns before pipes and pumps transformed the world. For most medieval households, water did not flow from taps. Wells were rare, rivers often polluted, and rain barrels unreliable. Families relied on carriers to fetch the water needed for cooking, cleaning, brewing, and sometimes even drinking. A single household might require dozens of liters a day, and the burden fell on those willing or forced to haul it. The work was grueling. Buckets were heavy, slopping over with every step, soaking clothes and chilling skin. Carriers used wooden yokes across their shoulders or straps across their foreheads to balance the load. The strain bent backs, callous hands, and wore bodies down before their time. Many water carriers were women, their labor unacknowledged, their strength consumed by the endless task of hauling life from one place to another. Children, too, joined the ranks, small arms gripping sloshing pails, learning early that survival was work measured in steps. Water carriers occupied a strange place in urban life. They were indispensable. Without them, cities would choke on thirst and filth, yet they were often invisible, their labor taken for granted. Few records celebrate their names. Chroniclers wrote of kings, bishops, and merchants, but rarely of the men and women who delivered the water those elites drank. The danger was constant. Streets were crowded with carts, animals, and people. A stumble could spill hours of work. Soaking dirt roads that drank the effort greedily. Winter made the ground icy, turning every step into risk. Summer heat spoiled water carried too long, forcing faster trips. Wells could collapse, rivers could flood, and wars could cut off access entirely. Water was survival, but survival was fragile. Carriers also bore the stigma of class. Their work was seen as lowly, unskilled, a task for the poor. Yet without them, no baker could knead dough, no brewer could make ale, no washerwoman could clean cloth. They formed the quiet infrastructure of cities, their shoulders the pipes of an age before plumbing. And here lies the irony. Water carriers moved more than buckets. They moved information, walking the streets, entering homes, frequenting wells. They became witnesses to the life of the city. Gossip flowed with water. News spread from bucket to bucket. In their silence, they stitched together communities more effectively than many officials. But their lives were fragile. Few grew old. The weight of buckets wore down bodies, bending spines, crippling knees. Accidents on slippery streets ended careers overnight. Poverty haunted them, even as their work sustained the wealthy. Their names faded, their labor absorbed into the anonymous hum of survival. And yet, every city rested on their backs. Without carriers, there was no bread, no ale, no clean cloth, no quenching of thirst. Civilization itself was carried in buckets, step by weary step. So the question rises, if water carriers held entire cities on their shoulders, why did history forget their names? By the late Middle Ages, the task of carrying water began to take on a more formal structure. What started as a daily burden of the poor evolved into a trade, sometimes even profession, one that revealed the stark lines of inequality in medieval society. In many cities, water carriers organized themselves into guilds or associations, similar to other trades. These guilds regulated prices, set standards, and defended their members against unfair competition. A carrier could not simply walk the streets selling water without permission. In some places, licenses or fees were required. Even survival was regulated. Guild organization brought some dignity to the trade, but also tied carriers to the machinery of urban politics. Wealthier guilds, those of merchants, bakers, or weavers, wielded influence in councils and parliaments. Water carriers rarely did. Their guild were modest, their voices faint. Yet, in their own way, they formed a protective network, helping widows of deceased carriers, setting agreed prices for deliveries, and ensuring that even the poorest homes could sometimes afford a bucket. But water itself was not free. Rivers, wells, and fountains were often owned by lords, monasteries, or city councils. Access could be taxed, restricted, or manipulated for profit. A peasant might watch water flowing freely in a lord's estate while struggling to afford a few pails in town. In times of drought, the wealthy secured supplies first, leaving the poor to fight over scraps. Water became a commodity, its flow controlled not by nature alone, but by privilege. This inequality was stark in cities with public fountains. These fountains, built at great expense, were often monuments as much as utilities, adorned with carvings and statues. Wealthy citizens sent servants to fetch water from them, while the poor lined up with buckets, waiting their turn. The sight of a noble servant filling barrels for a manor, while a mother waited with child at her side, revealed the truth. Even water mirrored hierarchy. The carriers themselves occupied a precarious middle ground. They were not wealthy, yet they profited by delivering to those who could pay. Their routes took them into the homes of merchants, bakers, and artisans, where a steady flow of coins in exchange for buckets provided meager stability. But when famine or war struck, demand dried up, and so did their livelihood. The poorest families could no longer afford carriers, turning instead to unsafe rivers or stagnant wells. Water also created tension between city and countryside. Rural families often had direct access to streams and wells, while urban households depended on carriers. This made city life more expensive and precarious. To move to a town meant not only losing farmland, but gaining dependence on another's labor for the most basic of needs. The water carrier embodied that dependency, a human reminder that urban survival came at a cost. And yet, carriers remained invisible in records. City accounts mention payments to water guilds, but rarely names. Chroniclers note fountains and wells, but not the bent-backed men and women who fill buckets. The anonymity is telling. Water was essential, but those who carry it were seen as tools, not people. The economics of water revealed something deeper. Unlike bread or salt, which could be stored, water demanded constant effort. It evaporated, spilled, and spoiled quickly. Carriers therefore represented an endless cycle of labor, repeated day after day without rest. No one ever finished carrying water. Like breathing, it had to be done again tomorrow, and the next day, forever. This endlessness made it easy to overlook. Yet it was precisely what made it vital. And so the city rested not only on its walls or markets, but on shoulders that carried buckets. The flow of water was also the flow of coins, of inequality, of power. Behind every sip, every loaf baked, every garment washed, there was a carrier who would walk the streets for hours, unpaid in history, yet essential in life. Which leaves us to ask, if water was wealth and carriers its lifeline, then how many medieval fortunes were built on the silent footsteps of those who bent beneath the yoke? For centuries, water carriers formed the pulse of medieval towns, their footsteps tracing the arteries of survival. Yet, as with all boring labor, their work was destined to vanish once technology replaced it. Still, before they faded, their role left deep imprints on culture, faith, and the imagination of cities. Carriers were more than workers. They were symbols of resilience. Ballads and folk tales occasionally mention the humble figure trudging with buckets, shoulders bent, shoes soaked. Their lives became metaphors for persistence, of bearing burdens endlessly, of never resting. In some stories, the water carrier represented humility itself, contrasted against lords who feasted or monks who prayed. If knights carried swords, these men and women carried civilization itself. Water carriers also appeared in religious rituals. Processions sometimes involved the carrying of water to bless crops, wells, or churches. Symbolically, the act echoed daily labor but transformed it into devotion. Just as water cleansed the body, carriers cleansed communities by their effort. Their unseen work gained a brief, symbolic recognition, though rarely did this recognition last beyond the ritual. As cities grew, carriers became more visible in times of crisis. During droughts or sieges, they worked day and night, hauling limited supplies, sometimes under guard to prevent riots. In those moments, people recognized their importance. For without the carrier, thirst spread as quickly as panic. Yet when peace returned, so did neglect. Their names vanished again into the slosh of buckets and the mud of alleys. The end of the profession came not suddenly, but gradually. Medieval towns experimented with aqueducts, cisterns, and primitive piping. By the Renaissance, wealthier cities invested in fountains connected to underground channels. In London, the great conduit system brought water into wooden pipes by the 13th century, reducing reliance on carriers for those who lived nearby. By the 17th and 18th centuries, advances in hydraulics and engineering spread, and the bucket trade declined. For the carriers, this transition was double-edged. On the one hand, it relieved generations from a burden that bent bodies and shortened lives. On the other, it erased their identity, their profession swallowed by progress. Few remembered their names, their guilds dissolved, their labor reduced to a footnote in history. Yet even as technology replaced them, the carriers' legacy endured. They represent a truth that echoes across history. Civilizations are not built only by kings, generals, or scholars, but by ordinary people doing repetitive, exhausting, invisible work. Buckets of water may seem trivial, but without them, no bread was baked, no ale brewed, no life sustained. Their disappearance also raises a broader question. How many other professions, vital in their time, have been erased by innovation? The lamplighters who once walked streets, the gong farmers who cleared waste, the scribes who copied books by hand, all forgotten as progress swept forward. Yet without them, the world we inherited could not have been built. So when we think of water carriers, we should not dismiss them as quaint relics of a primitive age. We should see them as reminders that history rests on shoulders unrecorded, on the labor of countless men, women, and children whose names were never written but whose buckets kept cities alive. And so we are left with a reflection as clear as water itself. If progress flows on the backs of forgotten labor, then who today carries the buckets we no longer see? And will their names, too, vanish when the pipes of tomorrow replace them? Imagine a monastery scriptorium in the 12th century. Rows of monks bend over desks, quills scratching, candles flickering, the air heavy with ink and prayer. But then the sound falters. A monk lifts his pen, shakes it, frowns. The ink pot is dry. Another flips through a stack of parchment, only to find the pile nearly gone. For modern readers, this seems trivial. For medieval Europe, it was a crisis. The world of ideas lived or died by ink and parchment. Every law, sermon, account, or poem existed only if someone had the tools to write it. But those tools were scarce. Ink was brewed from oak galls, soot, or minerals, often requiring long preparation. Parchment came from animal skins scraped, stretched, and cured over weeks. Later, when paper arrived from the Islamic world, it eased the burden, but paper, too, could run short. Wars cut supply lines, bad harvests limited resources, and sudden surges of demand drained stocks. Shortages were not mere inconveniences. They meant that chronicles went unwritten, letters undelivered, treaties unsigned. Ideas that might have changed history never reached the page. Knowledge that could have spread through generations vanished because there was simply nothing to write on. Consider the 9th and 10th centuries, when Viking raids swept across monasteries in England and Ireland. Beyond the plunder of gold and relics, scribes mourned the loss of parchment and ink supplies. Monks recorded bitterly that their libraries went silent, not just because raiders burned books, but because survivors lacked the tools to replace them. Silence spread like a shadow, not from fire, but from scarcity. Even kings felt the pinch. In the 14th century, during wars between England and France, trade routes for paper were disrupted. Royal accounts fell behind, treaties delayed, and bureaucracies faltered. A king without parchment was like a general without soldiers, powerless to command. But shortages also shaped culture in subtle ways. Scarce parchment forced scribes to reuse old texts, scraping off earlier writings to make room for new. These palimpsests preserved fragments of works otherwise lost, hidden beneath layers of ink. Ironically, the very poverty of material gave us glimpses of forgotten voices. Ancient plays, philosophical treatises, even lost gospels resurfaced centuries later, faint but legible, because medieval scribes could not afford fresh parchment. Ink itself carried its own crises. Recipes varied and poor quality batches faded quickly or corroded the parchment. Whole generations of records now lie faint or eaten away by their own ink. What looks to us like fragile aging was, to them, a desperate compromise in times of shortage. Better weak ink than none at all. For ordinary people, these shortages mattered in ways less visible but no less profound. A town clerk with no paper could not record births or debts. A merchant with no ink could not keep accounts. A peasant might never see his complaint written into law, because the scribe had nothing left to write with. The bureaucracy of medieval life, fragile at the best of times, collapsed when words could not be preserved. It is easy to overlook such details. We think of history as shaped by kings and battles, but often it was shaped by empty ink pots and bare shelves. And so the question presses on us: how much of the past is lost not because it was never lived, but because it was never written? And how many empires fell to the quiet plague of ink? In the medieval world, silence did not always come from conquest or plague. Sometimes silence came from something as small as the absence of parchment, the emptiness of an ink pot. Entire systems of power depended on these fragile supplies, and when they failed, kingdoms faltered. Consider the monasteries of Ireland and Britain during the 9th and 10th centuries. Viking raids are remembered for burning churches and stealing treasures, but they also disrupted the steady supply of parchment. Calves and sheep, the animals from which parchment was made, were slaughtered or scattered. The few that remained were needed for food, not writing. Monks recorded bitterly that their scriptoria fell silent. One chronicler wrote of hands idle, quills waiting, because skins could no longer be spared. The result was not just a loss of books, but the loss of continuity. Generations of records skipped, entire stories unrecorded, because there was nothing to write on. Elsewhere, shortages struck the machinery of states. In 14th century England, the crown relied on paper imported from France and Italy for its growing bureaucracy. But during the 100 Years' War, trade routes faltered. Shipments were delayed, intercepted, or destroyed. Royal clerks were forced to reuse old rolls, cramming new decrees between faded lines of past laws. At one point, the exchequer struggled to track tax payments because parchment stockpiles had been exhausted. A king's treasury could be full, yet his officials powerless to record it properly. Governance itself wobbled, not because of rebellion, but because parchment stores ran dry. The problem was not confined to the West. In the Islamic world, where paper was first mass-produced after being learned from Chinese captives in the 8th century, shortages also occurred. Baghdad's great libraries, fed by papermakers along the Tigris, sometimes slowed when floods or wars disrupted supply. Scholars complained that knowledge piled up in memory while waiting for paper to return. The transmission of science and philosophy across the Islamic Golden Age depended not only on brilliant minds, but on steady shipments of pulp, rags, and ink. These shortages forced innovation and desperation. Palimpsests multiplied. Old texts were scraped, their words erased to make room for new ones. Bureaucrats filled margins with cramped writing, squeezing decrees into whatever space remained. In some cases, leaders turned to substitutes. In times of famine, scraps of wood, wax tablets, and even bones served as makeshift writing surfaces. But these were temporary, fragile, and often lost to time. The social consequences were subtle but sharp. For peasants and townsfolk, paperwork was a fragile link between their lives and the law. A debt recorded could be enforced. A debt lost to shortage could vanish. A boundary dispute might simmer unresolved because clerks had no parchment to write the ruling. In such ways, shortages rippled outward, creating distrust in governments and courts. At times, scarcity itself bred power. Those who controlled supplies of parchment or paper wielded influence. Merchants who smuggled paper during wars made fortunes. Monasteries with herds of sheep gained prestige not only from their libraries, but from their ability to keep writing when others went dark. Knowledge became a resource measured in hides and rags as much as in intellect. The irony is clear. Civilizations that conquered, traded, and innovated were brought low not by swords, but by shortages of something as mundane as writing material. We imagine empires silenced by enemies, but often they were silenced by empty shelves, by a scribe's quill hovering above a blank desk, waiting for parchment that never came. Which leaves us with this unsettling thought. How many histories never reached us, not because they were destroyed, but because they were never written at all? The story of paper and ink shortages is not one of permanent despair. Eventually, technology triumphed. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the rise of widespread papermaking, introduced in the Islamic world, perfected in Italy and spread through Europe, changed everything. Suddenly, the fragile scarcity of parchment gave way to something closer to abundance. Rag-based paper was cheaper, faster to produce, and more accessible than animal skins. Towns like Fabriano in Italy became centers of papermaking, exporting sheets across Europe. By the 15th century, merchants, scribes, and scholars could write more freely. The spread of paper enabled not only the survival of bureaucracies, but also the flowering of culture. Without it, the explosion of books after Gutenberg's printing press in 1450 would have been impossible. Printing needed cheap, plentiful paper. Parchment could never have sustained it. Ink, too, advanced. Recipes stabilized, using iron gall and stood in ways that lasted longer and damaged pages less severely. Standardization meant fewer failures, fewer faded lines. For the first time in centuries, knowledge had a steady foundation on which to stand. The plague of ink, the chronic shortages that silenced voices, finally eased. And yet, the silence it left behind remains. For every parchment scraped clean to make a palimpsest, for every quill that hovered over an empty desk, there are countless words we will never know. Lost chronicles of kings, forgotten songs of villages, unwritten accounts of daily life, all swallowed by scarcity. History is not only what survives, but also what never reached the page. This gap matters. Our vision of the Middle Ages is shaped as much by what we do not have as by what we do. We remember nobles more than peasants not because peasants lack lives worth recording, but because ink and parchment were too precious to waste on them. We know more of wars than of harvests, because battles were deemed worthier of scarce material than bread. The shortages decided whose voices mattered, and whose were left in silence. Even after paper became common, echoes of this scarcity shaped thought. People still wrote sparingly, cramming margins, conserving space. Waste felt sinful, extravagance dangerous. Generations trained by famine of parchment carried its discipline into abundance. Today, in an age of digital excess, when words flow endlessly across screens, It is easy to forget how fragile writing once was. Yet the lesson endures. Civilization depends not just on ideas, but on the materials that carry them. Without parchment, paper, and ink, the greatest thoughts vanish like breath in air. So the plague of ink was not merely about shortages. It was about fragility, the reminder that human memory is always one empty page away from loss. And so we are left to reflect. If so much of history was shaped by the silence of unwritten words, then how much of our own age will vanish when the tools of memory change once again? For us, cleanliness feels obvious: water, soap, baths. But in the medieval world, the story was far more complicated. Washing was not always a guarantee of health. In fact, in many times and places, it was believed to bring danger. To wash was to risk illness, to invite weakness, to open the body to harm. The fear began with water itself. Medieval cities were riddled with contamination. Wells were dug near cesspits, rivers carried waste from butchers and tanners, and public baths often doubled as brothels. To immerse yourself in water was to immerse yourself in filth. People understood, even if vaguely, that disease followed water. They did not know of bacteria, but they noticed the patterns. A village that bathed in a certain river often fell ill. A bathhouse outbreak followed close contact. Washing became suspicious, not purifying. Medical theory reinforced the fear. The dominant framework of the time, the theory of humors, taught that pores opened during bathing. Warm water especially was seen as dangerous, softening the body and allowing miasmas or bad airs to seep in. Physicians warned against excessive washing, believing it drained strength and left the body vulnerable. A knight preparing for campaign might avoid baths for fear of weakening his vigor. A peasant might avoid them for fear of falling ill in already precarious health. Public baths added another layer of danger. Popular in early medieval Europe, they were communal spaces, places of gossip, relaxation, and sometimes illicit pleasure, but their popularity made them suspect. Church authorities condemned them as sinful, associating bathing with lust and immorality. When outbreaks of plague and syphilis spread through Europe, baths were often blamed. To avoid disease was to avoid the bathhouse. Gradually, the very idea of regular bathing declined, replaced by perfuming, linen changes, and dry cleaning methods. Yet, washing did not vanish entirely. Ritual cleansing remained strong in religion. Muslims, for example, maintained strict traditions of ablution before prayer, even in regions where water carried risk. Jews preserved mikveh baths as part of their spiritual practice. Christians, too, valued symbolic washing, baptism above all. But daily washing of the body, especially in water, became less trusted in much of Europe, an act associated with danger more than health. Ironically, the result was that not washing often seemed safer than washing. Better to wear clean linen than to risk polluted water. Better to perfume the body than to soak in a bathhouse filled with strangers. Better to embrace a little dirt than to open one's pores to illness. This attitude shaped culture for centuries. Medieval chronicles mention kings who bathed only a few times a year, nobles who prized scented oils over soap, and peasants who relied on smoke and sweat to mask odors. Cleanliness was relative, not absence of dirt, but absence of danger. And so we arrive at a paradox. In an age before germ theory, washing was not a path to safety, but a step into risk. Which leads us to ask, when people feared the bath more than filth, what did clean really mean in the medieval world? When Rome fell, much of its infrastructure fell with it. Aqueducts broke, bathhouses crumbled, and urban sanitation collapsed. Yet for centuries after, public baths remained common across Europe, inherited from Roman habits, and kept alive in towns both large and small. By the 12th and 13th centuries, they were lively centers of social life, but their decline was swift and dramatic. The church's suspicion of bathing played a part. Bathhouses, with their communal nudity, became associated with lust and sin. Priests warned that baths tempted the flesh as much as they cleansed it. Some councils issued edicts against mixed bathing, but the warnings went further. Bathing itself, they argued, weakened virtue by softening the body. Then came disease. Outbreaks of plague, leprosy, and especially syphilis in the late 15th century devastated public trust. The bathhouse, once seen as a haven of warmth and cleansing, became a suspected breeding ground of contagion. People noticed that those who frequented them often grew ill. Whether true or not, the reputation stuck. By the 16th century, many public baths had closed their doors, abandoned to ruin. In their place came a new culture of dry hygiene. If water was dangerous, linen became salvation. Physicians and household guides recommended frequent changes of underclothes, believing that linen drew out impurities from the skin. A wealthy noble might own dozens of fine shirts and shifts, changing them daily or even more often, while poorer folk may do with fewer, but still prize the ritual of fresh fabric. The act of changing linen carried symbolic weight. It was not simply clothing oneself anew. It was a form of cleansing, a way of keeping sickness at bay without the risks of water. Perfumes, herbs, and powders were added to the ritual, further disguising odors and reinforcing the sense of cleanliness without immersion. Linen became the poor man's bath, the noble's excuse, and the cultural norm. Superstition, too, shaped habits. Many believed that washing the head or feet at the wrong time could invite illness. Others thought that washing during certain phases of the moon was unlucky. Some saw washing infants as dangerous, fearing it weakened their small bodies. Even kings were cautious. Records tell us that Louis XIV of France, centuries later, bathed only occasionally, preferring to rely on linen and perfume rather than risk the dangers of water. And yet, bathing never vanished entirely. In parts of Central and Eastern Europe, bathhouse traditions persisted longer, especially in Hungary and Russia, where hot steam baths became cultural staples. These regions maintained faith in heat and cleansing, contrasting with the growing suspicion in Western Europe. Here, the divide was not just medical but cultural, shaped by local traditions and religious attitudes. Still, for much of medieval and early modern Europe, the guiding principle was caution. Water was potential killer, and to immerse oneself was to gamble. Linen, perfumes, and ritual cleansings filled the void, creating a society where clean meant something very different than it does today. And so the paradox deepened. People lived surrounded by filth, yet believed they were safe from it, not because they removed it, but because they masked it. Which leaves us to wonder, if linen replaced water as the measure of purity, how much of medieval life was lived in an illusion of cleanliness?